Hello and welcome to Learn It from a Layman. I'm your host, Timothy Cox, and we're joined today by many distinguished individuals and also Carl. We have Matt and Cameron, our regulars, and today, as a special treat, Katie, who is an expert in many things, one of them being our topic of the day. Wait, how am I doing?
No, I give you like a B minus.
B minus. Picky.
You said that I'm an expert in many things.
No, not that. What I'd say, not
I'm
enough
good at
credit
that.
to Katie, and not enough dig at me. So
That's right. Yeah, I
okay,
was kind of half-hearted.
yeah,
I'll do better next time.
exactly. Okay, a real quick introduction. This is Katie's first time on our podcast, so thank you for coming on, Katie. To give a
Yeah.
little brief bio of Katie, and then you can add anything you want. So our podcast tonight is going to be on basics of photography, and so we brought on Katie because Katie's got a lot of experience with this and a lot of education in this area. So Katie has a master's degree in, what's your master's in, Katie?
I have a master's of fine arts and arts administration.
Okay, all right, and so Katie's
Essentially a fancy way of saying I have an MBA for the arts.
perfect. So
yeah.
outside and besides then having all that knowledge of art administration and art, she also has a lot of work experience doing photography and those types of things. And anecdotally, Katie took my wife and I's engagement photos, which are awesome. So all right, well, we're going to go ahead and get it was a while ago.
And some of your wedding photos as well.
That is true. Also, some of the wedding photos. Katie's done a lot of work for the family in general, and she's been awesome at this. And so she's got a lot of knowledge to share with us. So we want to start with just some very basic things, Katie. What is most days? Obviously, we're talking about digital photography. Let's talk about film photography. What happens in a camera?
Love to. So if you go all the way back to the beginning, about 1820 is when the first photograph was actually taken. It was taken by a gentleman named Nice Niepce. And it was an accident, really. He had treated some glass that he had at his house, and he put it into a box that they call the camera obscura that they used to use for drawing. So they'd go into this little box and it would project the image upside down and they'd trace it really fast. And he did this on just of a rooftop in France in 1820, and it was the first photograph ever made. So when the very definition of photography is drawing with light. So what takes place in a camera is that you're taking materials that have not been exposed to light and you're exposing them and imprinting an image on them because they're being exposed to light. So that is, in a nutshell, what happens. Obviously, with film photography, there's a lot more chemical work that goes into it that I was a lot more familiar with, 10 years ago when I was going through my bachelor's program. But I love film photography. It's my favorite thing to shoot when I get a chance because there isn't any room for error. In today's digital world, so many people, can take. I just bought a card not too long ago that it's like a 400 gigabyte SD card for my camera. It takes 4,000 photos. It can hold 4,000 photos on it. So pretty much I have 4,000 chances to get.
That's a big roll of film.
The shot, yeah. So, but when you shoot with film, you don't have that opportunity.
Right.
You've got to get it right from the beginning, or you're going to waste a lot of money and a lot of time.
I really like drawing with light. I've never heard that before, and that's an awesome description or definition or whatever. So when you studied photography and the work that you've done in photography, how much of it is these days even film based versus digital?
Almost all of it is digital now. It's not film isn't taught very often anymore. Unless you go into a collegiate setting. I think most art programs that offer a bachelor's degree in photography will teach you the basics of film, just because you have to have an idea of the history of something and how it works. In my opinion, anyway, you have to be able to know how it works to really be able to do it well and do it justice. So there are a lot of departments that will just do digital. It's all digital. But for the program that I was in, I went to Southern Utah University, and we studied 35 millimeter film. We studied 120 film with a toy camera called a Holga. That it's a great and a terrible camera. We had to duct tape it shut so that there weren't any light leaks. We also did 4x5 large format. But most of the time now, what you'll see is people will say, "Oh, well, film is so, out of date, and I can just do everything on my digital camera, and I don't need to know how to do film," which I think is an injustice to the art. But that is, again, just my opinion.
Right. So are there any, I mean, other than maybe some just artistic effects, there are no benefits of doing film pictures versus a digital picture?
Not necessarily. There is some debate on whether or not a digital file will preserve for as long as a negative will. It's like I said, there's some debate on it that
Interesting.
no, if you shoot digitally, you'll have that digital file forever. But just like everything else, that digital file is going to lose a little bit of of its resolution and things
Right.
like that over time. So
Interesting.
whereas generally, if you preserve film really, really well, it will develop just as clear as the day you developed it originally, if you preserve it well.
Right.
So
that's an interesting computer science aside, thinking about how we encode the digital information and how is it stored and moved from different hard drives or whatever. Yeah, you could get some lost information potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a lot of the things that I've shot film, I've really tried to keep the film slides preserved really well, so that if I ever need to go back to them, I can. And in fact, I worked for a photographer in Cedar City named Carl Hugh, and he had a client come in one day, and they said, "We've got this photo of our dad that's been washed out," and it was I want to say it was of him like shearing sheep or something for the university. And they asked Carl if he took it, and he said, "No, but I know who did." And he called the guy and said, "Can you bring it over so I can scan it in?" And the guy brought it over, and he said, "I'll tell you what, here's the benefit of having a really good archival system, because all you had to do was tell me the date and I could go find the negative, the date and where it was taken." Right. So there are some photographers that are very good at archiving their negatives well, and others that are not. So
right. Tim, for example.
Yeah, Tim's terrible at preserving it.
But I do it on purpose so everyone else can feel better about their photography.
All right. Well, yeah, that's. I've always wondered. I mean, I've been alive long enough now to have made the transition from film to digital, and I didn't know if there was actually any benefit on film nowadays with all of the megapixel things going on. So
yeah.
Well,
and like I said, if you really want to prove your skill as a photographer, film, there's no room for error. You have to get it right the first shot, or you have to, like in my case, I shot my entire senior project on 4x5 slide film. So that's where you stick it in a slide holder, and then you put the cloth over you, just like the old timey photographers, and you're looking through the glass to photograph it. And if I didn't get it right, then that was, half an hour of loading and shooting, and then a half an hour of developing and drying, and another half an hour of scanning. That if it wasn't right and it didn't look good, I'd have to go back and do it all over again. Right. So I think it shows your skill.
Right. With digital photography, you can kind of just throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks.
Yep. Absolutely.
which, by the way, I've used that metaphor probably 100 times on this podcast. So it's really useful to me.
Must be a father of children.
A lot of spaghetti on the walls around here. Okay, so Tim, I know you had a couple questions for Katie, and as an aside, also, Tim, you teach photography, Tim?
I do. I'm a total expert on it.
Like
Katie.
There's a reason we brought Katie on, and Tim did the intro today. So, but Tim, questions for Katie?
Oh yeah, and just to clarify, I'm a junior high school teacher, and they needed someone to teach our digital media class, and so they said, Tim, can you teach that for us? And so one summer, beginning of year, I spent a lot of time on YouTube learning about photography and digital media, and now I teach it to junior high school kids. So I'm in no way an expert, but I've studied it a little bit, so now I know enough to know, how to pretend like I'm an expert. Anyway.
Which is what we do on this podcast, except every once in a while we get someone that has real information.
Really is, yeah.
Yes.
So, Katie, I was thinking if you could talk from a photographer's perspective on how what a photographer does technically, with a camera to get a good image in different conditions. How can you manipulate the camera in its different settings and abilities?
Yeah. I mean, there's always the option to set your camera to auto and just let it do everything for you. I would not recommend that. That hurts my soul a little bit every time somebody says, I'll just set my camera to auto and let it do everything for me. There are a couple of different things that you want to look at when you're photographing in different conditions in particular. For example, I have been doing photography now I have to do the math in my head. I've been doing photography for about 25 years, 26 years. And I started on the sidelines of football games with my dad doing photojournalism. And when you're photographing in those conditions, you want your ISO, which is the amount of light that you let into the camera, to be fairly high, and you want your shutter speed to be fairly fast. And that's how long the shutter will actually stay open for on the camera. And you want it to be faster because you're capturing motion. If you're shooting in lower light conditions, again, kicking that ISO up so that it's letting in a little bit more light. But, you can also, I like to shoot star photography a lot, and I'll always bring a tripod with me, and then just put my camera to bulb, which means that it will leave the shutter speed open until I tell it to close. And it lets in enough light to photograph stars. So you really, like, the two main components that you want to watch when you're using a digital camera is your ISO and your shutter speed. And those will really control whether or not your photo captures motion and whether or not it's lit properly.
And just to recap for everyone, so ISO is so the higher the ISO, the more sensitive your camera is to light. The lower it is, the less sensitive it is to light, right?
Correct. Mm-hmm. And then with your shutter speed, it's the opposite. The lower your shutter speed is, the longer it's going to stay open, the more sensitive it will be to light. The higher your shutter speed is, the less sensitive it will be to light.
And there's kind of there's a give and take, right? Like, so right. If people are wondering why don't you just always have a crank your ISO real high, like it's in some ways it can lower the quality of your photography, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that you saw a lot when digital cameras were first coming out, is that they hadn't quite mastered how to get that happy number where you could go in and shoot a photo indoors without a flash and not have your photo be pixelated and grainy. So there really is a give and a take. Most of the digital cameras today, though, I mean, it's so cheating in so many ways, because you can go up to 6400 ISO, which at one point in time was just unheard of, and you can go even higher now, and it shoots just fine. It doesn't need any more lights come in, and generally the photos aren't pixelated. But there is a give and a take, and you need to be aware of it as you're photographing. And it's something that I have become really complacent about. As I photograph family and stuff, I am notorious for getting the light set up in one location and then moving to another location and forgetting to check again. So I'll have photos that looked really great in one spot, and then they're totally blown out, and you can't tell that it's human in another space. Like, I've gotten really bad at I don't do it anymore. I'm not in the habit of checking it the way that I should.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Tim, did you have other questions? Is that it?
Yeah. How about one more? So, Katie, on a different level, when you are taking photography, what do you have in mind, kind of artistically, some of the basic principles of getting a good shot? How do you artistically set up a good image?
Oh, there are certain rules that they kind of teach you when you start a basic photography class that you want to try to follow as much as you can. The rule of thirds is one of those. If you take a shot or a photograph and you split it into 9 sections, you want your photograph to fall into one of the thirds, or to cross point in that third. Um, and that, especially when you're doing portrait photography, that rule of thirds is really important, because it makes the photo a little bit more appealing. There is a principle called leading lines, where you want all of the lines to lead into your subject matter, so that all of the focus just goes straight to your subject matter. You also want to take into consideration texture and contouring, and where you're photographing at, because that can make a big difference in what you do photo wise. For me, I've kind of gotten away from the more traditional snap a picture, everybody smile, and really have gotten more into, I shoot for projects now. So while I was in college, I started photographing dishes, which is random, and don't ask me why, but I photographing dishes and setting them up in um, different setups and breaking things. And I started photographing in water, and that's a whole different ballgame. It requires a whole different set of skills. Um, but really, the main things that every photographer will tell you is to watch your rule of thirds, to watch your leading lines, and to watch your framing. Those are kind of the basic. You can get a good shot if you watch these things.
Okay. And you've done photography of a lot of different, like you said, different objects, different things, different people.
Right.
What are some of the biggest challenges that you run into when doing people photography?
People are prone to not be natural in photos. Like, it's just something that has been ingrained to us like from the very beginning. I think it goes all the way back to the fact that when they started doing the daguerreotypes and wet plate photography in the States, they actually had to sit still for so long in order to get the picture that they needed, that people would wear these really big smiles, or just look very unnatural. And that is still something that a lot of people, like, I worked in a children's portrait studio in northern Utah for about 4 or 5 years, and that was what I saw, especially from the parents, all the time, like, just very rigid, and I'm gonna smile and it's gonna look like really a photo that could end up on Dateline. Like, how did we not know this person was crazy? But and then it just depends on the age group. I mean, little kids pose their own problem in that they, it's a stranger, and a stranger is trying to get them to smile, and it's intimidating to them, and it can be really scary, and newborn babies cry, and it makes that a little bit more difficult. But it just really depends on the age group. And I will always, until the day I die, say that newborn babies are my favorite to shoot, because once you get them calm, you can get the most beautiful pictures. Um, Newborn babies and sports photography. When I'm photographing people, those will always be at the top of my list.
Right. Now, about so does the background affect how, like, the you already talked about camera settings and things like that, but let's say I brought my family into the studio for a picture. Does the color of the background chosen by, like, the photographer based on, like, what they're wearing, or like color of hair? I mean, or does it not matter, and whatever the people want to pick, that's the pictures will turn out with a good photographer?
Nowadays, I would say that it doesn't really matter. Whatever you wear is going to be fine. Most photographers will tell you, like, before you go to take pictures, that I always suggest that people look on Pinterest and see, like, look at different color palettes and things like that. But now that we've gotten away from, back in the day when you'd go to Sears or Kitty Candidates or somewhere, and they'd pull down the background that's a picture of a fireplace with a tree, and it's clearly not your living room. It's not realistic at all. And you'd have people come in and their kids would be wearing, like, I don't know, jeans and a t-shirt and sitting on this really formal background with a Christmas tree. That's not so much the case anymore. I think that portrait studios have really tried to tap into that modern feel, where it's more wide open spaces and more neutral backgrounds. And so I don't think that you run into that problem as much anymore.
Okay.
I think that the backgrounds have really been simplified, which is great.
If I can make a note, I've noticed in some of the last few times that I've done family pictures or seen pictures taken, some of the photographers I've noticed have started using even green screens. So they'll just take a picture of the group on a basically green screen, and then you can add whatever background you want to the back of it, and as long as you take it right.
And as long as the people that you're photographing are not wearing green and do not have blonde hair.
Yeah.
The photographer that I worked with in Cedar City did that for a few dances. He did a lot of the high school dances. And when we would get ready to go in and put the background in on the green screen, there was inevitably some kid that wore, like, a teal blue that had enough green in it that we had to go and cut it out of the photo so that they didn't blend into the background. Or on the one that really surprised me was that blonde hair would reflect back the green, kind of like if you go swimming and you have too much chlorine in the water, your blonde hair turns green. The green screen would reflect back, and you'd see a lot of these blonde girls have part of their head gone because it had blended into the green screen. So
is that like a subtle dig at blondes there as well then?
Yes. No, it's just the color of their hair. So you'd probably run into it with people with white hair or gray hair as well, but we never photographed them on a green screen. And I work with green screen every day now, because I work remotely, and I am on Zoom all day. That's the only way I communicate with my coworkers. And so there are sometimes the green screen just doesn't work. Try your best. It doesn't, So, but Cameron's right. There was, for a period of time, and there still is, a lot of photographers that will say, we'll just do green screen and then we'll put in whatever background you want.
And also to note, which I don't think we noted at the beginning of the podcast, Cameron, your wife just told you that you were correct. So make note of that in your journal.
It has been noted, and we'll remember it this day forward. Also, I think we've glossed over aperture a little bit. I think we should probably hit
yeah. Aperture and depth of field is a.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Making up words
Yeah.
now, are we?
So yeah, aperture and depth of field really can depth of field in particular can really make a photograph go from meh to really fantastic. And that's when you take the photograph, and if you have a greater depth of field, then everything is in focus. One photographer that was really outstanding at that was Ansel Adams. Everything that he did had a greater depth of field. He started what he called the F64 Club, which is the largest your f-stop could go at that time. It freezes everything. So, but when you're photographing portraits, sometimes it's nice to blur out a lot of that background, and so you have a shallow depth of field, which means the subject is in focus and they're clear, but the background isn't necessarily in focus, and it brings them really to the center. So, anything else you wanted to add about that, Cameron? Because you said we glossed it over.
No, I think that's good. Just, I want to make sure everyone, knows that. I mean, and that's one of the fun, that's one of the fun things you can do is with your depth of field, like you can blur the background by doing the shallower one, just have your center person in focus, stuff like that. So.
Okay. Hey,
And,
Tim, you have another question?
Oh, well, I was just going to ask Katie to talk about how all these different settings like aperture and shutter speed can interplay. Like, if you have an open aperture and a long shutter speed, like you might have a washed out image or like so.
Yeah.
Katie, maybe you can talk through kind of like how do you adjust, changing one, how does that affect another, and what do you do?
Yeah. So your aperture can really your aperture goes back to your f-stop and your shutter speed. And again, f-stop is the amount of light that you're allowing to come to the camera. Shutter speed is how long it's staying open. One rule of thumb that my professors always taught us in our classes at SUU was the kind of the magic number for your ISO was to keep your ISO at 100 or 200, because it made sure that the photo wasn't grainy, and you could always enhance an image. If it was darker, you can always up your balance and your exposure. But if you overexpose a photo, it's really hard to get information back.
So
it's
better to turn out a little dark than. Okay.
Yeah.
That's good to know.
But that, when you're working with all of those, always the first thing that I will try to adjust so I don't have to mess with my ISO is I will try to adjust my f-stop and my shutter speed, just because the photo is going to be significantly clearer if I can avoid adjusting my ISO. So that's always, but it just depends on the subject that you're shooting. It all comes down to how fast are they moving. Are you doing photos like portraits? Are you doing night photography? What subject are you photographing, and how much light is there already in the room?
Katie, would you real quick explain f-stop for I think people might be like, f-stop, what's that weird, what is that?
So f-stop is how wide your shutter is going to open. So the shutter that opens and closes when you push the button is controlled by your f-stop, which dictates how wide it opens, and your shutter speed, which dictates how long it stays open.
And if I've got it right, the lower the f-stop number, the wider open your the opening is. Okay.
Yep. And the less the wider the f-stop, the less motion you'll capture. Things will tend to be blurry. For example, I used to shoot football at Southern Utah University for the Daily Journal, and I would pretty consistently, your f-stop goes up in certain increments, and at one point in time I could list them all off for you, and I can't anymore. But I would always leave my f-stop like at 16, which is kind of in the middle, and then adjust everything else around that so that I was capturing motion, because that was more important to me than, getting artistic and things like that.
Interesting.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
It's been a long time since I
Right.
since I taught
Right.
since I taught photography, so it's been a hot minute.
I've got a couple more layman questions here. So I know that
Sure.
we've talked about kind of different, like if you're in a studio, then you can control a lot of that, the settings. You talked about sports photography. Obviously, you're not in control of that. You just have to kind of grab what you can. But when you're outside doing a portrait, which you've done to me before, there's you have to deal with the sun, and well, obviously then when clouds come, and then backgrounds and those types of things. But in
Right.
particular, I guess, like, what do you do about shadows? Is it better to like I think when you took my pictures, Cameron was standing there with some type of reflective surface. Well, what
Yeah.
all do you do with that?
Oh, is that when he was holding it in front of your face, I think?
Just blocking
Yeah.
it out. All of our
Blocking
engagement photos are
blocking
actually just
everything.
of my wife. So
Yeah. So it depends on the conditions. I use a reflector a lot, which is, it's generally a big circular item that Cameron and I fight about whether or not it should be on the gold side or the silver side. It should be on the silver side. Don't listen to Cameron. I have a degree in this. So the reflector will take light and it will bounce it back, back onto the subject. So if there are shadows or things like that, if you can get the reflector in the right place, then it can eliminate a lot of those. But on the other end of the spectrum, if the sun is directly above you, I can reflect light back, but you're still going to be washed out. And so a lot of reflectors inside of them, if you unzip it, they will have a filter that you can hold up, and it softens all of the light coming through. So you can hold it above them. You'd see this a lot back in our day and age, like when those of us that are here speaking right now were in high school, when photographers would come and they'd photograph sports teams outside, they'd almost always have the little scrim that they would put up over the top of the person to diffuse the light.
Interesting.
So it just really depends. The last couple of times that I've done photos, we've actually forgotten to bring a reflector, and Cameron, bless his heart, was wearing a white shirt, and so he got to be my reflector. I just told him, go stand right here, and I'll tell you where to move, and luckily it worked, and we were photographing one of our niece's senior pictures, and she thought it was hilarious, so we had a good time with that.
It's a great analogy of a good marriage.
Yeah. Be willing to be your wife's reflector.
Exactly.
Hey, don't photographers like an overcast day for that kind of diffusing? Okay.
Yeah, for that very reason, photographers really like when there's just a little bit of cloud cover overhead, because it diffuses the light from the sun automatically.
Okay. One other question from me, and then we can open it up to either Cameron or Tim or Matt. But I know that nowadays, you take all these digital photographs, like you said, you've got like this whole, and then you've got, your editing software, right? You've got Photoshop or whatever it is. And how much time do you spend in like post editing? What kind of adjustments do you frequently make? What kind of magic can you do there?
That really depends entirely on the client that I'm photographing for. Like, I have some things that I will do automatically. I have some presets in Lightroom that I'll do, and then I always start in Lightroom, and then I export everything into Photoshop. Just I can do a lot of global edits in Lightroom. So my white balance, my exposure, my shadows, and my highlights, I can do in Lightroom and then export into Photoshop. There are times with. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to ask, could you in 30 seconds, what are your automatic things that you do?
Yeah. So automatically when I open a photo, I will almost always open up the shadows a little bit. So I'll take my shadows and I'll open them up a little bit so the shadows aren't quite so harsh. And then I will generally lighten them a little bit because more often than not, I've shot a little dark. So I've got some room to play with exposure and things. And then I will up my contrast and my saturation a little bit, just because I like things to be really bright and pop. And then from there, after I've done that, I will generally create, it gets a little more complicated after that, and I'll create a mask and darken the background a little bit so that the subject really stands out a little bit more. So, and then you get into, retouching the face. If you've got a teenager that has acne, I'll almost always retouch at least underneath the eyes and flyaways from the hair. Then it just depends on whether or not it was a group. And Cameron and I have one nephew that just cannot take pictures seriously for the life of him. Like, he does not want to be there, and he's going to let us know. And so maybe one shot in 25 will have Garrett looking at the camera and smiling normal. And so we always have to, go back through and find the one that looks the best of everybody else so we can move Garrett's head from one photo to another. It's called the head swap. And that is always lots of fun. So that's some Photoshop magic there.
We'll certainly need that if this podcast ever goes on a poster somewhere, and then we're going to need to do some serious head swapping. Can I head swap with, say, Brad Pitt, or what are my options?
Yeah, sure. You let me know.
Okay.
You let me know who Debbie wants you to be, Carl.
Exactly.
And I will do that.
All right.
So,
okay.
Because let's face it, the wives are really in charge.
That is true, and I am the reflective surface. Yes.
There you go.
Okay. Final questions, Cameron or Tim or Matt?
I guess one, if you're looking at getting into photography, or at any level, beginner, medium, advanced, whatever, what types of things do you look for when you're selecting equipment, cameras?
So I have always been a fan of Nikon. I will probably always use Nikon. It's just what I grew up using.
With the brand.
Yeah, so Nikon, the brand. And then from there, your next biggest expense once you choose your body, and most of the camera bodies now are going to have, they're going to be sufficient for your needs. The next thing you want to look at is your lenses. And the lenses can vary from, price wise, they can vary from a couple $100 to, 20 to 40,000, depending on, the telephoto quality. But for most people that are just getting started, I will tell them, get a wide angle lens. I use a 24 by 70, 2.8, because it gives me a little bit more room to zoom in and zoom out, and I can take bigger groups with it or singles. And then from there, it just depends on what you want to get into photographing. So it just really depends. That's when I would go to a really, really good camera store and tell them what you're looking at, and have them kind of walk you through the different lenses.
So a little bit more than megapixels.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the megapixels are important, don't get me wrong, but a really, really good lens is important to have. So, and if you're in Utah, I'll just put a plug in for Picture Line. I love them. I have purchased many items from them, and all of their staff is very knowledgeable, and they're very eager to help, and not necessarily eager to make a sale. So they're more eager to help you find what you need.
Awesome. Okay, Tim or Cameron?
Would you put in a word of encouragement for? I think a lot of people are really intimidated by photography. They think that it's out of their league, and they also might think that they need to have like tons of equipment and stuff. Is that what would you say to someone who's like, I'm just gonna, I'm probably just gonna, how would you encourage someone in that boat?
More and more, the equipment that you have is not, you don't really need to worry about that, because the newer iPhones and the Google Pixel and some of these newer phones that are on the market, even the ones that are a little bit older, have great cameras, and it gives you accessibility to shoot anywhere. I would tell someone, if they're intimidated by the lack of equipment that they have or whatever, I would just remind them that like I said at the beginning, it's painting with light. So you have the power to tell your narrative through painting with light, and that is something that has been a great comfort to me. I've worked through a lot of issues and trauma in my life behind the camera, and I would just let them know it doesn't matter whether or not anybody ever sees what you photograph, as long as it means something to you, and as long as it was therapeutic to you, or it helped you feel better as an artist or as a person, or if it just relieved tension in your life, then that's all that matters. It doesn't matter if anyone else sees it or if anyone else thinks it's good. All that matters is what you think.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, that's a great way to finish, unless Cameron has any additional reflective information, like this particular variety of white shirt you should wear.
A bright white shirt, and it also helps if you're a large person to be reflective.
Shoot, take her out.
I was going to say, I don't know if kids today really have as big of a problem getting into art. Everyone is on Instagram or Snapchat taking pictures, doing stuff, and basically all you need is a stand for your camera and a ring light. And then you're good to go, and that's pretty cheap. So
awesome. Well, I appreciate, Katie, you sharing your information and knowledge with us about photography, and Tim,
anytime,
for whatever you contributed.
Moderating.
All right. It was really appreciate it. Before we sign off here, I just wanted to update our podcast user. Dang it, I would say user because I'm a software person. Our listeners are global, as I've said before, but we've got a new distinction. Every state in Germany is now listening to us. Every province, state, and territory in Australia, but we still can't wrangle those Yukonite, whatever they are, the Yukon territory, Tim.
Oh, the Yukonians, yes.
So, and across the United States, so feel free to share this, and please do share this information, this podcast, with your friends. We'll have people that really know what they're talking about on, like Katie, frequently, so that we're not always just, listening to Tim.
Heaven forbid.
His kid, the students that actually go to his school don't even listen to him. So. All right. Well, thank you, and we'll be back again next podcast.